This gentleman here is Francis Crick. And he is, of course, famous for being one of the co-discoverers of the double helix structure of the DNA molecule. And he won a Nobel Prize for that. The latter part of his life, he spent thinking about the other big problem, which is human intelligence and the brain. In 1979, he wrote this essay called Thinking About the Brain, which had a huge impact on my life. And this was a critical essay. He said, you know what, people have been studying the brain for a long time, even back in 1979, and they had amassed a huge amount of data. But he said, in spite of this accumulation of detailed knowledge, how the human brain works is still profoundly mysterious. He said, we were clearly going to get more data over the time, and we're going to come up with new techniques for measuring and understanding how the brain works. He says, but it may not matter because we're just not thinking about the problem correctly. He said, to understand the brain, we need new ways of thinking about it. More experimental data will not be sufficient. So this is a real sort of wake-up call for neuroscience. We're just not going about this in the right way. And then here's a longer quote I want to read to you. He says, what is conspicuously lacking is a framework of ideas within which to interpret all these different approaches. It is not that most neurologists do not have some general concept of what is going on. The trouble is the concept is not precisely formulated. Touch it and it crumbles. Ouch. He's being really critical here. He's saying, you know, people act as if we understand the brain or what's going on, but he says we really don't. And to me, when I read this article, I said, wow, that's incredible. I want to spend my life working on that. And that's what we do in Memento. We work on this, developing this framework for understanding the neocortex. Now, that we think about the human brain, the neocortex is about 75% of the volume of the brain. That's a picture of the neocortex right here. The other 25% consists of like the brainstem and the spinal cord and the cerebellum, and it's like a post that sticks up inside of the neocortex. The old part of the brain, the old 25% of the brain, did things like autonomic control of breathing and heart rate, reflex reactions, maybe even running and walking are controlled by that, emotions. But when we think about things, everything we think about intelligence, it's really the neocortex. Everything about perception and language and thought and planning, all your conscious perceptions are all in the neocortex. And even today, how it works is still a mystery. It's also, in my opinion, the most important scientific problem of all time. Not only are we as humans really basically a neocortex, and all of our issues and problems in society are related to our brains, it is how we think, it is all of our arts and sciences, and I believe understanding the neocortex will be important for the long-term survival of our species. I'll get back to that more at the end of my talk. So here's my talk outline. I'm going to go through some background material because I can't assume everybody knows a lot of neuroscience. I want to get you up to speed where we are. And then I'm going to introduce this new framework for intelligence and cortical computation. And then at the end of the talk, I'll talk about some of the implications for the new theory. All right, let's go into some background material. Here's a model of the neocortex. It's a dinner napkin. And if you could take a neocortex out of your head and iron it flat, it would be about this big. And about this thick, a little bit thicker. It's about 1,500 square centimeters in area and 2.5 millimeters thick. In this tissue, in this neocortex, there's somewhere between 15 and 20 billion neurons. Now, one of the tenets of neuroscience is that every perception and every thought and everything you've ever occurred to you and perceived is basically the activity of neurons. So some of these neurons are active, most of them are inactive at any point in time, and the ones that are inactive represent your current thoughts and perceptions. The neurons are connected together. There are thousands of synapses or connections between each neuron, so there's somewhere between 50 and 100 trillion synapses in the neocortex. And the second tenet of neuroscience is those synapses contain all the knowledge you have about the world. So everything you know, everything you've ever learned is stored in those connections. Now, if you look at the surface of the neocortex, it's very uniform. You don't see any demarcations. But we now know that different areas do different things. This was first discovered when people had trauma and they had an injury in one spot and they said, oh, they can no longer see, or they can't do language, or they can't think about certain types of things. But we now have mapped out the neocortex in great detail. We know that these different regions are connected to each other with bundles of nerve fibers through the white matter. And some of those regions are assigned to different things. So let's just talk about that and go back to the slides here. So now we have, here I've shown some of those regions. I've highlighted in blue some visual regions, some auditory regions, some allocentric regions. Those are multiple regions in those blue highlighted areas. You see there's a large part of the cortex you can't easily associate with vision, auditory, or somatic input. And the basic way people think about this is the following. They say, well, the input comes in from some sensory organ, such as the retina. It projects to the first visual region in the back of your brain, and that visual region extracts some sort of simple features, and then those simple features are passed to the next region, which extracts some complex features, which projects to the next region, and after a few of these, you end up with some sort of object representation. This is people believe the same basic thing is happening in different modalities, such as touch, and so your skin projects to the somatosensory regions, and a similar type of process. And somehow, in these, most of the neocortex, there's some sort of multimodal associations, multiple modal objects, and so on. This is the basic idea of how many people think about the brain today. It's actually not really true, and I'll get to that in a moment. When you actually look at map out how regions of the brains connect to each other, and this has been done, and the first real great map was done in 1991 by two people, Feldman and Van Essen. This is what they reported. This picture on the left shows each of those little rectangles is a region of a macaque monkey's neocortex, and it's basically showing the somatosensory regions on the left and the visual regions on the right. And the lines are bundles of nerve fibers, millions of nerve fibers that are going between each of these regions. And you can see it's very complicated. There's connections going all over the place, and there's parallel horizontal connections and parallel regions, and there's level skipping going on. So we can first of all just say this is a very complex structure. It's not a simple flow chart like in the upper right. It's certainly not strictly hierarchical. In fact, in 1991, they reported that 40% of all possible connections between regions exist, which is much greater than you would get in a hierarchy. And now we know that number is much, much higher. With new techniques, we know that there's a far greater connectivity. So that's kind of confusing. Now, the strange thing about it is no matter where you look in the neocortex, if you look at any one of these regions, the local circuitry anywhere is remarkably the same. So you have all these regions doing different things connected in this crazy way, but then every region looks like it's doing the same thing. This was first noted by perhaps the most famous neuroscientist of all time, Ramón y Cajal, a Spaniard. And right around in the late 1800s and early 1900s, he started mapping out all different types of parts of the brain. They had just discovered these staining techniques where you could take a bunch of neural tissue and it would stain just some of the neurons. And this was important because if you stained all the neurons, it would be big black mass. So by staining some of the neurons, they could start seeing what they look like. So here on the left of the picture here is a slice of the neocortex. You see it's 2.5 millimeters thick. And this stain highlights the cell bodies, so the neuron bodies. And you can see they have different shapes, they have different sizes, and they have different packing densities. And they started noticing that they appeared to be layers. And so they started saying, oh, it looks like there's 6 layers of neurons in the neocortex. And this looked the same everywhere. Then the image on the right is a different stain that not only stains the cell body, but it stains the dendrites and the axons that are coming out of the cells. So now you can see how they're connected. And you can see there's a lot of vertical connectivity going on across the layers, and some layers have more horizontal connectivity. So for the last 120 years, many neuroscientists have been mapping out what these circuits look like, what these neurons look like, how they're connected together. It's an incredibly rich field of data. People like ourselves who are theorists, we create models from this. So we build pictures like this where we're looking at the different cell layers and trying to figure out how they connect together and what they're doing and the different types of connections between them. We can just summarize some of this. First, we could say there are dozens of neuron types in the neocortex. They are organized in layers. How many layers you get depends on how you measure them. And you could say 6 to 10, depending on which way you break them apart. But there are prototypical projections across layers, meaning that everywhere you look, the same type of connection, and the information basically goes vertically. It comes in one layer, and it goes up, and it goes down, and back and forth across the layers. There are horizontal connections, but they're more limited, and they only come from certain layers. Another thing that was discovered was that all regions of the neocortex have a motor output, and I've shown that here, labeled this one of the green arrows coming back out. And this is surprising. You'd think you might have heard that there's a motor section of the neocortex, but in reality that all parts of the neocortex are motor cortex. And so you say, well, what would the visual cortex have to say about movement? Well, it turns out that the regions in the visual cortex project to an old part of the brain that moves the eyes. And the regions in the auditory cortex projects to a part of the brain that orients the head. And so when you're listening or when you're seeing, it's an active sense. You don't just see by getting input from the eyes. You see by moving the eyes and getting inputs. And that's how the cortex works as a general principle. And then, of course, as I've said already, that every part of the neocortex has similar circuits. Now, there are variations, and so people point out, oh, this part of the cortex is a little bit more of this, and this part of the cortex is a little bit less of that. And so there are variations that are going on, but there's this complex common circuitry everywhere. And so there's something fundamental going on everywhere in the neocortex, and it's complex. The first person who really made some sense of this was a gentleman named Vernon Mountcastle, and he had this huge idea. By the way, he is like one of the fathers of neuroscience, and he was really the guy who has some of the most elegant writings about the neocortex. He was at Johns Hopkins, and he had this big idea. In 1978, he published a monograph, and in that monograph, he made the following claims. He says, well, look, the reason that all areas of the neocortex look the same is because they perform the same basic function. They're all doing the same thing. And what makes one region a visual cortex, another region an auditory region, is what it's connected to. Literally, he's saying you could take a part of the neocortex and stick an auditory nerve into it, and it would become auditory cortex. Or you could take, and if you stuck a visual nerve into it, it would become visual cortex. And then, which is an amazing idea. And then he said, a small area of the cortex, about a 1 millimeter square area, which he called the cortical column, is the unit of replication and contains this sort of common cortical algorithm. He chose a millimeter square because in that square millimeter you would have all the different cell types, all the different connections, all the different physiologic response properties. It wasn't that this cortical column is a physical thing. It was that it was a small enough unit that contained everything. We sometimes make pictures like this to illustrate this. So here we can imagine a slice of the neocortex, and you're looking at the neocortical sheet, and we're showing these individual columns packed in there. In a human, there'd be 150,000 of these columns. Now again, they're not physical like this. If you actually look at the cortex, with just a few exceptions, you wouldn't see this, but this is the way to think about it, and this is the way a lot of neuroscientists do, is what this column looks like. Now, Mountcastle's idea was one of the biggest ideas ever in science. I put it right up there with Darwin. Darwin said that we have this tremendous diversity of life, and all of it comes about because of a single algorithm repeated over and over again. And Mountcastle is saying we have this tremendous diversity of intelligence, and everything we think about of intelligence, whether it's language or music or arts or physics and mathematics, is all based on a single algorithm. It's an incredible idea. It's so incredible that many neuroscientists today have trouble dealing with it. It's like they don't know how to interpret it, what to do about it. But it's clearly true, and it should be a foundation of all neocortical theory. Okay, so the next question I want to address is, what does the neocortex do? And over the years, people propose different ways of looking about it, but I and other neuroscientists, many of us have come up with this perspective. It's a thing about the neocortex. What it does is it learns a model of the world. So when you're born, you don't know about the world. You don't know about buildings and cars and people. You don't know about trees. You don't know about computers. You don't know about everything. And you don't know any languages. You don't know any words. You have to learn all of this. And so you have to learn this model of the world. And in your cortex, you have a model of the world. And when you interact with that model, you'll see it makes predictions. So let's talk about what does that model consist of. There's thousands and thousands of things you know. You know how they look, how they feel, and how they sound. Objects in the world that you interact with every day. You know where these objects are located relative to other objects. So I'm sitting here, I'm in a room and I see a door and a screen and a floor and a table and chairs. These things I recognize, but they also have a relationship to each other, and I would not expect to see the door on the ceiling or on the floor. I know how objects behave. So, for example, a door has hinges and it can open and close, and it has a latch that goes up and down. Or my computer has all kinds of behaviors that it changes as I interact with it. And we also learn this for both physical and abstract objects. So I can model physical things that are in front of me, but I also model abstract concepts, maybe like democracy or places I've never been to, and yet I still have models of them. And then finally, it's a predictive model. So you have this model in your cortex, and it's constantly making predictions about what's going to happen next. And this is its value. Now, it makes predictions at all levels. So even every time I touch something, I have a prediction of what I'm going to feel. And every time I move my eyes, I have a prediction of what I'm going to see, even if I'm not consciously aware of this. But I also can make predictions about long-term things. So if I'm trying to apply to get a grant for my science, I might say, should I apply early or late? Or should I use this language or that language to improve my chances of getting accepted? So we're trying to predict the outcomes of our actions all the time. I wrote an entire book about how the cortex builds predictive models. It's called On Intelligence. So this is what the brain does. This is an incredibly complex model of the world that is stored in your neocortex, and we want to understand how it happens. So the question we want to now is how does the neocortex learn this model using the circuitry that we've talked about? So now we can switch to our new framework for this. So I'm going to start with a thought experiment. This occurred to us a couple of years ago, and it was a real revelation, and sort of a bunch of things came out of this thought experiment. We were asking how it is I can predict what I'm going to feel when I touch an object, such as a cup like this. And it sounds simple, but it's a very complex question to answer. And what we realized was the following. I asked myself, well, what does the brain need to know? What does the cortex need to know to predict what I'm going to feel when I move my finger to a new location and place it down on top of the cup? So I'm going to touch the rim of the cup here. And I can imagine what I'm going to feel before I feel it. The cortex needs to know several things. It needs to know that it's touching a coffee cup. It needs to know, it says, oh, I know what this object is because that's a requirement to know. It also needs to know where the finger is going to be on the cup after the finger comes down. If I move the finger in a different direction, I'll touch something else and I'll feel something different. So it has to know where it's going to be, and it needs to know what object it's touching. Now, if my finger is first on the side of the cup and I'm about to move it, I have to know where it is originally and where it will be based on a movement. So essentially saying, well, okay, where's my finger now? Where will it be after I move? And then I can make a prediction about the cup. Now, this is a location, where it is a location relative to the cup. It's not relative to my body. The same thing with a curve, the cup is at a different angle, and so on. So the cortex needs to know a location in the reference frame of the cup. It's kind of hard to imagine it would do that, but it must need to know that. Now, if you realize that when you touch the cup with multiple fingers at the same time, or with your hand, all parts of your skin are making the same type of predictions. So my different fingers are touching different parts of the cup, but each one independently and simultaneously predicting what it's going to feel, and therefore each part of my skin has to know where it is relative to this cup. There isn't a single location. Every part of my input has to have a location. And so this tells us that in the primary sensory cortex, in the neocortex, in this case touch, but the same is going to happen in vision and audition, there has to be a representation in the neural tissue of the location on the object that I'm touching. This is a really interesting idea, and we ran with it. Okay, back to the slides. Just about a year ago, we published our first paper on this idea, and it was called, the title of the paper was "The Theory of How Columns in the Neocortex Enable Learning the Structure of the World." And I'll give you just a brief synopsis of what's in that paper. We argued that a single column in the cortex is, say, receiving input from the tip of your finger, is able to learn complete models of objects. How does it do that? I mentioned it had to have a location signal, which I'm illustrating here in blue. So you have an input coming from the finger, and you have another input coming from a different layer in the cortex, which we believe is in layer 6, and that represents the location of the input relative to the object. So now I have two things. I have the actual sensation coming from the finger, and I have the location on the object. These arrive in layer 4. This is well-known anatomy. And so now if I think about that, I say, okay, I know the sense and where it is, and if I move my finger multiple times, I can basically build up a model of the object, what the different features are at different locations. And we propose that that's being assembled in an upper layer, layer 2, 3. This object layer is a stable representation, like this would represent the coffee cup. It's the stable representation, meaning as I move my finger, the input changes and the location changes, but the representation in the output layer is stable. So I associate a set of features and locations with an object. We then went on to show that what would happen if I had multiple columns at the same time. So imagine I have 3 fingers touching the cup at the same time. Each one is sensing a different location, has a different input. Each one on its own would not be able to determine what the object is. But they can by voting, meaning at this object layer, they can all be uncertain, say, well, I don't really know what this is. It could be A, B, and C, and the other one says this could be B, C, and D, and the other one says this could be B, X, and Q, and they say, oh, it must be B, the coffee cup. We modeled this. We showed simulations on this using realistic neurons. We showed the capacity of the system. But the basic idea is if you only had like one sensory, like one finger, imagine I was asking you to recognize an object by putting your finger in a black box. And you touch, with one touch, you almost certainly couldn't recognize what the object is. But if I can touch, I'd have to move my finger in multiple locations. But if I can grab it with my whole hand at once, I can usually get it in a single sense. So multiple columns can infer objects in a single sensation by voting on object identity. This is touch, but you should realize that the same thing is going on in vision and other sensory modalities. When you think about the eyeball or the retina, it's not a single thing. It's like the skin. It's a set of sensory organs arranged on the retina, and each one of those is projecting to a column, and each one, it's like the visual cortex doesn't look at an image, it looks at lots of little pieces of it, just like when you get the inputs from your fingers. So the same basic structure works in all modalities. We had a big question though. Like, we propose that this location representation is in layer 6, in one of these lower layers, but how could that be? Where could it come from? What does it look like? How would the brain know a location, and what does it mean to know a location on an object? In this paper, we didn't answer that question. We left it as a question, but we suggested where to look to find the answer, and that turned out to be correct. What we suggested is we should look in something called the entorhinal cortex. Now, what's going on in the entorhinal cortex? You may have heard of these. In the entorhinal cortex, there's some things called grid cells. Here I have a picture of a rodent and a human, and it shows these two older and smaller brain structures. They're not part of the neocortex, called the hippocampus and the entorhinal cortex. You can see in the human, they're like the size of maybe your pinky. They're sort of wrapped around on the inside towards the older part of the brain. Grid cells are a very hot topic. A lot of people have been studying them. Nobel Prizes have been awarded for them. And what they do is they represent the location of your body relative to an environment. So, and we have them too. So let me just give you what do I mean by representing the location of your body relative to the environment? So I'm in a room right now, and I have a sense of where I am in the room. And remember, when you have a sense for something, there's cells that are representing that. That's the grid cells in my entorhinal cortex. And they're representing where I am. And even if I close my eyes and I take a couple steps over here, I have a different perception of where I am in the room. I know now that the stool is further away, that window is further away. If I step back here, I know I'm closer to it again. So this sense of where I am is actually these grid cells in the entorhinal cortex. And they're updating as I move. And because they update, even if I'm not looking at anything, then you know that they're updated by my movement themselves. I don't need a sensory input to tell me this. The brain says, if you moved, I know you're in a different location. I'm going to represent the location differently. Okay, let's go back to this. So these grid cells represent the location of the body relative to an environment. The big idea we have is that grid cells also exist in the neocortex, that they were preserved in evolutionary time, but then now they're used for something different. The cortical grid cells represent the location of a sensory input relative to the objects you're sensing. And I'll go into this more in detail. First of all, I need to tell you how grid cells work. Now, this is complicated, and if I lose you on this, we'll come back and you don't need all the details about this, but the details are important and they're interesting. So let's just talk about some basic things about grid cells, how they represent location. Typically this is done with a rodent, such as a rat or a mouse, and here we have a rodent walking around in a room, and if I were to stick a probe into one of the grid cells in its entorhinal cortex and say, well, when does that grid cell become active? When does it fire? You would see that it becomes active at different locations in this environment. Whenever the rodent is in one of those red spots, that cell becomes active, and when it's not in a red spot, it's relatively inactive. And this occurs no matter how the animal moves on their own. That's where the term grid comes from, because it's a sort of a grid-like pattern in the room where this cell becomes active. Now, we know, as I just mentioned a moment ago, that the grid cell's activity is updated by motor commands, because this even happens in the dark. If the animal is moving around in the dark, it doesn't have to see anything for these grid cells to say, hey, we're in a new location now. Now, this isn't very useful to knowing exactly where you are, because it could be any one of those spots. If we then probe the next cell over, one right close to the first one, a different grid cell, we might see that it becomes active in these blue areas. And so you can see there are very similar spacing and similar tiling going on here. It just represents one little further over. In fact, there are grid cells that represent every spot in this room, but they're all sort of the same tile. So grid cells on themselves can tell you something about where you are in the room, but they can't represent a unique location. So how does the brain get around that? The basic way we believe, and other people believe it gets around, is this follows. Imagine I had two grid cell modules, meaning two sets of grid cells, module 1 and module 2, and they differ slightly. They might differ in their spacing of where the firing fields are, and they might differ in their orientation relative to the room. Now, if I wanted to know where I am in the room, if I looked at the cells in module 1, I might say, well, I could be at any one of those red spots because that cell's active. And if I looked at module 2, I could say I could be any one of those green spots because that's where this cell is active. But if I look at the two modules together and say which two cells are firing, one from module 1 and one from module 2, it turns out you end up with a unique location. And so you can now say, by looking at those two cells together, aha, I know where I am, because that's the only place where these two cells are, when those two cells are active, it must be at this location. And if you have a set of modules, the number of locations you can identify uniquely grows exponentially with the set of modules. And so you can create a very, very large sort of space of locations in the world. And so now the animal can know exactly where it is. One of the things that I won't explain in more detail, but state, is that the representation of location is different than the kind of thing you learned in high school. You know, it's not like X, Y, and Z. And in this case, the location, meaning which cells are firing, which grid cells are firing, is unique to the position in the room and to the room. So if I know my location, I know where I am in the room and I know what room I'm in. They're unique in all the world. So it's a very unique thing. Okay, that's the basics about grid cells. Now, the theory is, and this is, many people study this, is that the entorhinal cortex use grid cells to learn and map environments. Like, how do I learn the spaces in the rooms I'm in? And we do the same thing too. And so the grid cells represent your location of the body relative to the room. I show two rooms here that are different in the sense that I've shown one having a green wall and one having a blue wall. And so the rat or the rodent will see these as different rooms, even though they're the same size. And I've marked 3 different locations, or labeled 3 different locations in each room. In room 1, I've labeled location A, B, and C. In room 2, I've labeled location D, E, and F. But remember, every location in the room has a unique representation. And as the animal moves, these location representations change. Notice if I go from A to B to C, or if I go directly from A to C, I'm always going to get the C. This is called path integration. So no matter how I get there, you're always going to get the same location. Now, if you think about this, since each of these, all these locations are unique to the room, that a room can be defined as a location space. Of all the possible location representations in the world, there's a unique set that are assigned to each of these rooms. And so we can think about a room having this location space. Even if the animal's never been to some corner of the room, it still has a representation for that location. Now, what we're proposing is the following. The neocortex does something very similar. But instead of the animal, your body moving out in the room, it's your sensory patches or your sensory organs moving relative to objects in the world. So in the cortex, the grid cells represent the location of a sensor input relative to an object. In this case, where my finger is relative to the pen or relative to the coffee cup. I've labeled 3 locations on the cup, X, Y, and Z. I've labeled 4 locations relative to the pen. And as you move your finger, the cortex updates its location relative to those objects. Notice if I go from V to T and I go through location W. W is not on the pen, but it's still in the location space of the pen. So the location space is bigger than just the object. The object is contained in this location space. And so the cortex would be tracking where that finger is as it moves. So every object in the world now has its own unique location space. And this is the key to understanding how the cortex models the world. Objects have their own location spaces, and we have to start thinking along those lines. So now we go back to the drawing I showed you earlier, and I said, well, we didn't know how the location relative to the object was represented. We now believe that there are grid cell modules in each cortical column. I showed those by these little green rectangles here, and so they provide the mechanism for representing the location, and everything we've learned about grid cells now applies to the cortex as well. We had another paper which is just posted just a few weeks ago, which talks about the mechanisms between how these grid cells in layer 6 and layer 4 actually interact. It's a more detailed paper, subset of this overall theory, and that's mentioned Lewis et al. So let's review our proposal so far. We propose that the grid cells exist in every cortical column, and they represent the location of the input to the column relative to the object being sensed. Each column is now able to learn complete models of objects because it knows these location signals. And the objects in the world have their own unique location space. So once we understood this, there's a whole series of other problems that we've been puzzling over for years that became clear how to solve them. I'll just go through a few of them. And as I mentioned here, this basically defines a location-based framework for understanding the neocortex. So let's talk about one of these things. One of these things is compositional structure. Everything in the world is composed of other things. So a door, imagine a door, it has panels and a shape, but it also has a handle that goes up and down or rotates. It also got a little hasp that goes in and out. It also has hinges, and the hinges have pins and there's screws and so on. So every object in the world is like this. Cars consist of other things. And so the cortex has to learn objects as composed of other objects arranged in particular ways. The example we're going to use again is our coffee cup. In this case, we have the coffee cup with the Numenta logo on it. The cup is a previously learned object. I mean, I know coffee cups, and the logo is a previously learned object. I've seen that elsewhere in the world, and I'm trying to learn a new thing, a new composition, which is the cup with the logo. I've never seen that combination before, and I want to learn it very quickly and efficiently. I don't want to have to relearn the cup or relearn the logo. I want to be able to say, here's a new object, consists of something I already know, and something else I already know, bingo, it's done. Here's the new object, and I basically want to carry on all knowledge associated with the logo and all knowledge associated with the cup into a new object. So we realize this can be done by thinking about location spaces. The two objects, the cup and the logo, have their own location spaces. I've labeled 3 points or 3 locations on the cup, A, B, and C, and I've labeled 3 locations on the logo, X, Y, and Z. And when the logo is positioned relative to the cup, they're in this case, if I move the logo on top of the cup, then A and X are physically the same location, meaning point A on the cup space is physically the same location as point or location X on the logo space. The same is true with B and Y and C and Y. So those blue arrows, in some sense, represent it's like a transform, a way of saying if I can go between the points in the space of the cup and the points in the space of the logo, I can define where the logo is on the cup or define a new object. And so every point in the logo and every point in the cup, there's a one-to-one correspondence between those two. So basically there's one sort of blue arrow, one sort of transform that can represent this new object. And how can that be done? We are proposing a new type of cell to do this. And we call it displacement cells that solve this problem. It's a fundamental problem. It has to be solved by the cortex. Here I'm going to illustrate a little bit about how displacement cells work, just to give you a flavor for it. Now what I'm showing here are 3 grid cell modules. These are the actual, imagine these little rectangles are actually populations of neurons in your columns, in your cortex. And I'm showing at one time, the green dot represents which cell is active. That's just representing